Well, I think we can go ahead and get started there. And first off, wanted to say thank you everyone for joining and taking time out of your busy week to join us with this presentation today. This is part of Coalition's Security Week programming, where we're being joined by a number of our partners to talk all things cybersecurity. And for all of you who are joining, whether you're one of our broker partners, one of our policyholders, or just interested in learning more about security and about cyber risk, there is a lot of change that's happening across the industry. Day doesn't go by where you don't see another major headline about a company experiencing some sort of major breach or issue. And so we're excited to bring you a number of different presentations this week talking about what's happening in the security world, what you, most importantly, as an organization can do to help prevent these types of incidents from happening to you, or at least if they do, know how you can respond and how you can put the right controls and measures in place. So today I'm excited to be joined by our partners at Reciprocity. We're going to be talking today about happier audits. Now, if any of you have had the fortune or maybe misfortune to go through an audit process, you know that there is a very high burden put on sort of going through that process and showing that you have all of the right sort of controls and compliance in place. But we're excited to sort of talk about how you can make some subtle changes to how you think about risk holistically, to put that process on autopilot and make it far easier for your organization to manage risk and manage risk proactively. So I'm excited to be joined by two folks today. So first, Dave Schmoller from Reciprocity. He's the Director of GRC Services at Reciprocity, and I'll let him introduce himself in just a moment. And then secondly, Catherine Lyle, who's the Head of Claims at Coalition and responsible for helping policyholders recover from claims and incidents. My name's Jen, and I'll be moderating the discussion this morning. So first, I'm going to hand it over to Dave and then to Catherine to talk a little bit more about their experience, and then we'll kick off this conversation.
Thanks, Jen, and thanks, Coalition. Good afternoon and good morning to everyone. When I joined Reciprocity about 5 years ago, I made the transition from being the auditor who was conducting audits to now a customer success advocate who advises customers on how best to respond to and prepare for audits, among all the other things they have to do for governance, risk, and compliance. Prior to Reciprocity, I spent nearly 25 years in auditing, including 6 years in public accounting and the rest in internal audit across a wide variety of industries. I was a chief audit executive for 13 years, reporting to the board and overseeing operational and IT audits, SOX assessments, fraud investigations, and enterprise risk management, which of course included cybersecurity and cyber risk management. I really blend the deep subject matter expertise with the passion for customer success to bring a well-rounded perspective on all things GRC. Now, Catherine, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Thank you, Dave, and thank you for Reciprocity for joining us today. My name is Catherine Lyle. I'm the Head of Claims at Coalition. And similar to that customer experience, we're here to ensure that each one of our insureds receives the attention necessary when they're dealing with a claims event, a cyber event. This is a pre-breach event. This is a during breach event and post event. So we will handle all of those types of matters and walk our insured through the needs, wants, and desires that they have during these kind of unfortunate events. I know at Coalition, and as you know, we take this holistic approach to try to avoid the event in the first place. But when you can't, we're here today to talk about that risk transfer. So when an event, if an event does occur, you have that ability to transfer that risk.
Great, thank you. And excited to be joined by both of them who have such deep experience across everything from compliance to risk management and claims and insurance remediation. So thank you both for joining us. So before we dive in, just a quick note on Zoom. I'm sure we've all gotten far too familiar with how to use Zoom over the last year, but just in case, at the bottom of your screen, you should see two icons, a chat icon and a Q&A, and we would encourage you to submit questions throughout the presentation, and I'll be moderating those, but we'll also have some time at the end for dedicated Q&A, so keep them coming. So we're gonna be talking about a few different things in this conversation. So first, we're going to be talking about holistic risk management and sort of the role of risk management as a part of your overall cybersecurity strategy and posture. And we're going to talk specifically about how GRC programs and tools can help in that entire process and help you be prepared for an event should the worst happen to your organization. We're going to talk about some of the specific claims and risks that can occur when organizations unfortunately don't have those compliance protocols put in place. And then finally, we will have some time at the end for Q&A. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Catherine, who will kick us off.
Thank you, Jen. So as I alluded to kind of in my introduction, we're going to be talking a lot about kind of risk, the risk that arises from not being compliant, but also the ways to handle risk, what risk is, all of those elements. So launching off first, let's talk about what risk is and what risk isn't. Moving on to the next slide, we can see that risk is, it's an event or a condition, right? It doesn't mean it's going to occur. Risk doesn't, the loss from a risk, all of those elements of the risk, it doesn't have to occur, but it is something that you have to be aware can occur. If it does occur, it can have negative effect, right? So you can be harmed as an individual if risk occurs, but as a business, in the realm that we're talking about in cyber risk, if a risk materializes, it means harm to your business. What this means is you can have business interruption, you can have loss of customer relationships, you can breach a contract. There's multitudes and different types of risk that come into play during the course of a cyber event. There's also different types of risk. It could be, hey, how much do we risk because we have this type of data? How much do we risk by not knowing where our data is? What if we don't know our data? So it's all of those types of things that lead to the loss, the harm that arises from risk. What risk isn't is the after fact, right? The aftermath of the risk. That's the harm, that's the loss. So when it has materialized, it is no longer a risk, it is a known fact. It is a known harm, it is a known loss. But to be able to look at that, you have to kind of look at the risk analysis, right, Dave? You have to start to look at the likelihood and severity of this.
That's right. We use risk analysis to really help us make better decisions on risk and ultimately guide us on what to do. Namely, we focus on the decision side of where and how we can control the risk or reduce it, and where and when we can transfer the risk or insure it. So like you said, we look at likelihood. It's really the probability or the frequency that risk will materialize and negatively impact you. We look at the severity or the impact to know, well, if it happens, how much are we going to feel that effect? And the third thing we commonly will look at is velocity. So again, if that risk happens and it's going to impact me, how quickly am I going to feel the impact? How quickly is it going to be spread across the organization? Now, I live out in Florida. I live near the beach, so kind of looking at something, an analogy of how to think about this is, so look, I want to go to the beach, so I do some analysis. I know that I could be impacted by sunburn, but look, I have the UV index, the UV forecast. I can kind of use that to help me know when to go or when not to go. I know there's a risk of drowning at the beach. So I'll use the beach flag warning, which tells me if there's a possibility of rip currents, which may tow me out and increase the likelihood that I could drown. And of course, the other part is just injury, right? There could be a shark attack. It's super unlikely that I'd be attacked, but if I were, the impact's likely going to be severe and it's going to be quick. So that velocity is going to be really high. Now, once I do that analysis, then you're really ready to think about what are those treatments. So Catherine, with the treatments are really those decisions that you make about risk. Like many decisions, you're weighing in your limited resources, which often is your time, your money, the people, kind of balanced out with your desire to achieve your goal or achieve your objectives. In this case, again, my objective is I want to go enjoy the beach. So I could just do, first of all, I'll just accept that there's some risk. I might get sunburned, I could get stung, but relatively speaking, with all the sort of things considered, I believe today is a good day. So I'll just accept whatever risk there is and I'll go enjoy myself. So that's one way to think about it. I could also choose to avoid the risk. I could just not go out to the beach today. I'll just stay in and watch Netflix. But like most of us, we're tired of doing that in the last 12 to 18 months. The other side is I could still go to the beach, but maybe I'll stay out of the water just so that jellyfish and the sharks, I don't have to deal with that, right? I'll just avoid it. Like I said earlier, more often did we lose the presentation? I'll keep going while we get that back up. But more often what we're trying to do, as I said before, we're really focused our decisions on reducing and transferring that risk to balance achieving our goals with our limited resources and kind of reducing or transferring the impact of that. So as we think about reducing the risk at the beach, I could use sunblock or protective clothing that would reduce the risk of sunburn. I could spend time to spot, possible rip currents along the beach before I get into the water. Again, that's an activity that I can do. Or I could also reduce that risk by swimming where there's only lifeguards, knowing that they're going to help protect me even if I get caught in a rip current. The other aspect, right, it isn't always just reducing risk. It's also about transferring risk. That's really important. And I know Catherine knows this more than anyone, but I will transfer risk of financial loss I'll purchase health insurance, right? So if I end up getting hurt, getting severely injured, I know that my insurance policy covers me for most of those healthcare expenses. So balancing all that out, I can go enjoy the beach, after I've done my analysis and done the right treatments so that I feel good about where I stand with risk. Now, Catherine, I'm talking about, the beach, and I'm sure everyone enjoys that, but I know we want to talk also about how this risk applies more in the business world, such as unauthorized access to your networks or your customer data. So with all that said, we'll go to the next slides. We're going to talk a little bit more about GRC programs and those sorts of things because, again, risk drives the relative importance of compliance for the organization. So as we mentioned earlier, we want to start with risk. Risk is unavoidable. So when you think about the compliance side, there's really different authoritative sources that we'll follow. And again, risk management, risk analysis is going to help us drive what decisions and what things we need to think about. So first category is really in the compliance world, and the authoritative sources from that is required, right? We've got laws and regulations that we just have to follow. Some examples would be HIPAA, which is covers basically health information and protects that. Sarbanes-Oxley is a law for large public companies, right, that have to comply and look at their financial controls over their financial statements. Some of those regulations come from industry where they're required. The payment card industry, or PCI, has a standards council, which is Amex, Visa, MasterCard, Discover, I think also the Japan Credit Bureau, that if you want to house, transact, transmit, or anything else related to credit card information, well, you've got to follow the PCI standards. So those are things that are required. There's others that are going to come from contractual sources or company sources. That would be customer contracts, perhaps, that require you to have data protection or data security. There's going to be employment agreements, right, that maybe it requires life insurance on your key personnel. So again, that's a compliance aspect that you have to follow. There's also internal company policies, right? Say travel expense reimbursements. There's just certain procedures and certain things that are required for you to be reimbursed for travel expenses. And then the last would be best practices, right? You don't technically need to comply with those sources, but if you do, you really can prove to others that you're doing the right thing, right? That compliance is really showing outsiders, right? Could be bosses, customers, other users, you're doing things the right way. That's particularly useful for the business to business type companies. So it really helps convince your buyers to trust the company with sensitive functions or sensitive data. Now, some examples of those would be like SOC 2. SOC is System and Organization Controls. It's a US-based standard by the American Institute of CPAs, but it really shows around security, around other data protection, that you're handling hosted data properly. There's an international standard called ISO 27001. That's the International Organization for Standardization. And that's really something similar to SOC 2. It's a little bit more robust, but certainly accepted internationally. And then last but not least, I think the best in class standard, at least in the US, would be NIST, or the National Institute of Standards and Technology. The 853 standard really sets the stage for excellent cybersecurity. Again, all these things show that you have best practices and good security in place. Now, with any compliance program, if we go to the next slide, really, we've started with risk, and we've determined that good compliance is going to be part of our treatment. So implementing controls, which is how we go from better risk management to better and happier audits, which I usually think, most people think of better and happier audits as easier audits, and I get passing grades. So really, those compliance authoritative sources, we're responding to those requirements, the requirements of what you must do, and the control is how you respond and how you implement those requirements. So the nice thing about a control, and which is why it's really important with risk management, is the control, as we've already talked about, is that idea of how I've reduced the risk. At the same time, I can also comply with the requirements for compliance standards. So I'm really killing two birds with one stone, which is amazing. A control could be a requirement could be example that you must have strong passwords. Your control might be that, well, all of our passwords are at least 8 characters or more. And number 2, if your control could be that passwords are rotated quarterly, so you're forced to change those. All that, again, reduces the risk that you'll be negatively impacted. And by prioritizing what controls you should implement through risk management, you really get a jump start on the compliance end. If you go to the next slide. Now, some companies will choose to track everything in spreadsheets. I mean, spreadsheets are cheap and it's easy to organize information. But when you think about it, you begin to list out your risk, you're listing out all your risk treatments, your list of controls, your controls to requirements relationships. Further to that, you've got policies that relate to the controls. You have to document all those relationships. And then there's all the details about who owns the risk, who's managing the treatments of the risk, who owns what controls, how are we going to test those controls, what evidence do we need. My point here is spreadsheets really grow very quickly and begin to multiply. And then you start having multiple spreadsheets and trying to build the relationships, and it gets a little out of hand. And not only that, anyone who has access can make changes, and more likely than not, no one's ever going to notice. So that's why you kind of enter GRC tools. GRC tools not only help you with organizing your data, but also the steps to integrate that risk management and all the good stuff you should start with to your compliance side. Go to the next slide. Now, implementing compliance without a tool, as you can see, this is a pretty simple checklist of kind of boiling everything down to how do I take my compliance program to the next level? Where do I start? The key point here is understanding the requirements from the risk program or those authoritative sources is the first step, and then really writing and implementing controls on down to testing those controls and gathering evidence. Next slide. So as you think about, again, a GRC tool can really help you take that, your risk management process as well as your compliance process to the next level. It's really important to know what's important to think about from those tool perspective. First, I think you want to find fast time to value, right? You're investing money in that, so you want to get a return on it quickly. Secondly, would be ease of use. I mean, spreadsheets are easy to use, but we've already talked about it can create a lot of complexity and a lot of inefficiency very, very easily. So if you have an easy to use tool, what I see the biggest benefit is then it's easier to collaborate with others in your organization, right? You break down silos and really everyone can get on the same page. Obviously, automation helps in reducing that manual effort to build some efficiency while maintaining really more effectiveness. And I think the other key takeaway from a GRC tool is that you have all that data there and all that activity. Well, now you have dashboards and reporting to provide you accurate and better insights, which leads to better information and decision making. Now, if we go to the next slide, I'll give you an illustration of what does this look like for risk management, right? So number one, you can identify better in a central way your risk register. So you've got all your details about what your risks are. And again, that's just simply defining what could happen to you. Next, you have an easy way to collaborate with folks to analyze. So that's doing the risk calculations. It provides process management around how to do that assessment and how to do that scoring. And then the act side, right? You need to know how to treat it. So, having workflow and being able to delegate that across the organization, as well as being notified when risks change or when those treatments have failed, you're alerted to that in a better way. And ultimately, it provides that seamless integration and collaboration between the risk function as well and the compliance function. ultimately they can share the same control and it meets both purposes. So that of course provides lots and lots of visibility. If we go to the next slide, and Catherine, I'm not sure if you're able to join us or not, but let's if you are, yay.
Give it a go, right?
Right.
Nothing. Someone said, what is the risk of having your Wi-Fi go out during a webinar?
Absolutely. Totally agree.
And to my point, that's actually not the risk. That's actually the result, the loss. So let's talk about risks related and related claims, right? We have situations where when we have insureds that are prepared ahead of time, having done this inventory, having done compliance, having done all of those elements ahead of time, during the course of an event, have a far easier time when working with forensics and counsel and all of those elements, because they're able to turn to a spreadsheet, they're able to turn to a framework, they're able to turn to, Dave, what you're talking about, having that availability. Having those frameworks, it's just, as it says here, an external mandated to-do list. But insurance claims can still come from security incidences, even though you are compliant. So risk is, even though you thought you were being averse, it's really not fully being averse. So being non-compliant is also a risk, but having the ability of having that inventory, having all of that information, being able to kind of understand first what your risk was, being able to analyze it, and then put it into play. That's what's key, the key here. So cyber risk is a business risk. This is that underlying part. It's all folded into all of these elements. Being aware and being of what the risk is, being able to then look at it, examine it, and then decide, okay, what part of this risk can we take on? What part of this risk, which is where insurance comes into play, can we transfer to insurance?
Yeah, Catherine, I think that's a really good point. And what I see, working with customers frequently is they're really hyper focused on implementing controls to reduce risk. But what they fail a lot of times is to look at that, what's left over, and am I willing to accept that leftover impact? And really, you think about a lot of things in cybersecurity. No matter how many controls and how many things you put in place, there's always a risk still that you could potentially be disrupted, or that you could lose, lose data. And so,
right. Well, being compliant doesn't mean,
that's right.
Being compliant doesn't mean you don't have any risk. Similar to in an auto, you may be buckled in, doesn't mean you still don't have the risk of harm, right? Those things still occur. And so it's not complete avoidance. And so that remainder, right, if we go back to long division, that remainder is that which a company has to decide, is that risk I can assume? Is that risk that's, substantial enough that I need to transfer? And that's when we as carriers come into play.
Exactly. All right.
Yeah, and I just want to pause right here, Dave. There was a comment from one of the individuals of that, some clients are less compliance oriented and purchase, right, cyber risk to pass along all the risk. And that is where, when we've just been talking about coalition being this holistic approach. Well, when we act as a threat actor, right, when we're scanning the universe, when we're looking at our insureds, we're looking to see which ones are really oriented to be more compliant, right? They don't have RDP, they are using MFA, those types of elements that come into play so that they work with us for that holistic approach, right? So it's a coalition. They work with us and we work with them. So to avoid those, which I call a morale hazard, right? That person that drives horribly because they're like, but I have insurance, it's okay.
Right.
So to your point, Carrie, thank you.
It's like taking a rental car and driving it like a rental car, because you're like, well, I don't own it, so And
Dave, I don't
bought
know what you're talking
insurance.
about. It's never happened.
Well, I'd never do that, but I've been around people who look at it that way, right? That, well, I bought the insurance on the rental car, I don't own it,
Exactly.
so I can just drive however I want to, drive crazy. And to
Right.
your point, those are the morale hazards that quite frankly, in my experience in business and working with insurance companies, more of the general like business percepted. I mean, you want a business to have a good compliance program in place, right? Because their risk of loss and all that's probably better, but more importantly, they have a strong risk management program to really make informed decisions about what they're doing. And when they're coming to transfer that risk of the, on the insurance side, boy, they're doing a lot of the right things. And, relatively speaking, that's good. They should, I would think, get better rates and really just have a better partnership overall. So again,
Okay.
having a strong risk program leads to better compliance, obviously, but I think it's really just holistically making sure that you're thinking through everything and covering all your risk through really controls and compliance, as well as insurance and transferring.
Absolutely. And so the way that individuals, if they want to, that are listening now, and obviously our insurers that want to take advantage and work with you, Dave, in the future, right? We go to control.coalitioninc.com. You'll see our technology partners. And that's where you can start to tie in. All coalition policyholders get discounted solutions. So this is how, again, we've been talking about that holistic approach, how we all, we're working together, and we're working with our partners such as yourself, Dave. I'm going to open this up right now. Are there any questions that while we have the experts on the line?
Yes,
Please
I
let
saw
us know.
question in the chat box, Catherine, and it was asking about different standards and if there was one that was more universally acceptable. So I can speak to that. So the ones I mentioned were SOC 2, ISO 27001, and NIST 853. And I would characterize it this way: that SOC 2's I would say largely universally acceptable, but it's also probably the most basic. But working with startup companies and startup businesses, that's typically, from a security certification perspective, where they start, because it's good basic security and enough to protect your data. For sure, it's still a robust standard. ISO is similar, but it's something that companies in Europe and really outside of the U.S. would certainly be more aspired to that. Certainly, there's U.S.-based companies that are ISO certified too, but it's largely because they interest outside the United States. NIST 853 is really robust. It also provides the basic backbone for something called FedRAMP, which is if you want to go into the federal marketplace and protect and store federal data, you're going to have to be FedRAMP authorized. And NIST 853 is really that robust standard. I believe it has something like 900 standards within NIST 853, whereas the SOC security trust service principle, you're talking just it's less than 50. So just if that helps you on some scale of knowing which is more acceptable. NIST, of course, is more acceptable, but it's also way more expensive and difficult to put in place. But that said, it's really probably the granddaddy, more robust standard of all of them. So,
but to the
great.
core of kind of what we've been talking about,
Mm-hmm.
Being compliant isn't a security measure. It's not a risk avoidance. It is not, risk mitigation. It is not risk. It's not an assessment of your risk tolerance. So these are all conversations that need to happen within a company, because it is not something that one person can decide alone.
Absolutely.
Well, I don't see any more questions right now. The beautiful part of all of this is that both Dave and I are accessible via email, phone, intercom for coalition users, all of those elements. So please feel free to email any one of us. We are more than happy to continue the conversation and wish everyone a great rest of the balance of the week. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you. And just one last question I see was about documenting measures or specifying measures. It's really balanced. I think a lot of them are more telling you general requirements, and you have to figure out how and what to implement to respond. NIST is very, very detailed and very specific. So it has way more again, it's robust, so it's more specific about what kinds of measures you can implement. I would also add that PCI, the payment card industry, very specific about what you should implement. So definitely a balance of that. Hey, Catherine, it's been great to sharing the stage with you. I really enjoyed it, and thanks again to Coalition for allowing Reciprocity to come and speak today. So really appreciate that. I look forward to connecting with you out in space. Again, email and other ways to contact us, as well as reach out on LinkedIn.
Thank you again, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.